Good evening. Thank you for joining the Nantucket Historical Association for our lecture series. My name is Jocelyn Wong, and I am the Director of Community Engagement here at the NHA. Tonight, we will hear from Deborah Sorensen, our Robyn and John Davis Curator of Exhibitions here at the NHA. She develops and manages exhibition plans across the NHA's historic properties. Before joining the NHA, she worked for 17 years at the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C., crafting exhibitions and film programs for architecture and design-related topics. More recently, she served as senior content developer for the Milken Center for Advancing the American Dream. She received her master's in museum studies from George Washington University. Tonight, Deborah will kick off the NHA's Summer of Sarg with an introduction to the beloved puppeteer, illustrator, entrepreneur, and Nantucket summer resident, Mr. Tony Sarg. She will discuss the artist's globe-hopping life and prolific career. In addition, she will share background on how the exhibition Tony Sarg, Genius at Play, originally organized by the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, was brought over to the Whaling Museum, adapted and expanded across the NHA's properties. Please welcome Deborah Sorensen.
Okay, so I'm going to give a little bit of background in where this exhibition came from, how we adapted it, as Jocelyn said, and then walk you through a little bit of Tony Sarg's life and career and his connection to Nantucket. Why are we here in the first place? Hopefully, can I see how many people have actually seen the exhibition upstairs already? Great. So a lot of what I'll be covering is kind of walking through that experience with a little bit of extra detail and weaving together how those stories really do reflect upon Sarg's prolific career as a diverse and multifaceted artist. Although I'm sure most of you know who was Tony Sarg, just very quickly, he was a lot of things for a long stretch of time here in the United States, but he was an early 20th century illustrator and commercial artist. But he's probably best known as the father of modern American puppetry, which is kind of a weighty title for such a lighthearted individual. But in addition to those kind of titles, he was also an immigrant twice over and a very energetic entrepreneur, as Jocelyn mentioned. He found success in several overlapping creative areas. And this was at a time when kind of the line between art and commerce was very thin. And his special genius, though, was in the creation and cultivation of an artistic and a commercial brand that celebrated innovation and also promoted fun for all ages. It's worth noting, since we're here on Nantucket, how is he connected to Nantucket? And we'll get into more of this in the full presentation, but just very quickly, why are we here talking about him today? There are the reasons that are listed here, ranging from his participation in the kind of emerging art colony of the 1920s on Nantucket. He also used a number of island motifs in his wider body of commercial work. But probably the short answer and the obvious answer is because Nantucket is home to the largest collection of art and artifacts that document his life and his career. And why? Why is that? How did that happen? Why Nantucket for an artist that for most of his career was based in New York? That's because in the 1920s and 30s, the Sarg family, including Sarg's wife Bertha, or Bert, and their daughter Mary, they were very well-known summer residents. You can see Mary actually in the photograph on the right. She's dressed in costume on the steps of the Thomas Macy House. It's a site that Sarg later portrayed in the poster you see on the right and in other works. And after Tony Sarg's death in 1942, might feel like I'm jumping ahead a little, but there's a reason, Mary remained connected to Nantucket. And in 1983, she donated a great variety of her father's watercolors, papers, artwork, books, and memorabilia to the Nantucket Cottage Hospital thrift shop, hoping that their sale would benefit island residents in much the same way that her father's work had done during his life. Businessman Philip C. Murray, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, of Murray's Toggery, he learned of this and he purchased the entire lot of material and then donated it to the Nantucket Historical Association. This was really an act of remarkable forethought and generosity that inspired many others to give from their own collections and continues to inspire others, forming the basis of the NHA's remarkable Tony Sarg collection. But the core group, if that core group of material arrived in 1983, there was an exhibit of work in 1984, but why are we here now in 2024, just past the 40th anniversary of the arrival of this collection? Why is this happening now? And what you see upstairs is really the result of a tremendous effort on the part of the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. They originated the Tony Sarg Genius at Play exhibition last summer, and co-curators Stephanie Plunkett, along with Lenore Miller, really worked together over many years to develop this exhibition, as well as the catalog that I'm sure many of you may have already purchased or have seen in the gift shop. The installation at the Norman Rockwell Museum took a very expansive look at Sarg's life and career, really a huge survey of material. It included sections that were devoted to his different artistic pursuits, illustration and puppetry, animation and map making, commercial design, and books. It also included an area devoted to Sarg's connection to Nantucket and the Tony Sarg shops, as well as kind of a particular focus on his sea monster hoax of 1937. As part of the arrangement with the Norman Rockwell Museum, the plan was always to bring Genius at Play to Nantucket, including not only items that the Norman Rockwell borrowed from the NHA, who was the largest contributor to the exhibition. Around 200 objects were sent there, but a whole range of artifacts from other institutions and private collections. And here we are. So at the Whaling Museum and other NHA properties, we've included many of the same objects and storylines that were on view in Stockbridge, but not everything would fit in the same way, not surprisingly. We're a different museum, we have a different audience, different space that we're dealing with. So we decided to really build upon the presence of Genius at Play here at the Whaling Museum as our featured exhibition to add 2 smaller kind of satellite exhibits at other locations. And these include playful pictures, books, and illustrations that are at the Research Library and the Whitney Gallery. And then also I Spy, pictorial maps by Tony Sarg and others, which is great fun, and it's at Hadwin House right now. And the reason for doing this was really to draw people to other historic sites and use as much of the materials we could during our Summer of Sarg. Of course, changes were also made to the featured exhibition here at the Whaling Museum. A key change was that we pulled out sections that were devoted to the different locations in which he worked and lived, that kind of personal story, and then paired that along with the different creative pursuits and areas in which he worked. So both personal and professional kind of weaving together throughout the exhibition. We also added a section devoted to his daughter Mary and the arrival of the collection here at the NHA, and just how special that is as a reason for this show to exist at all in the first place. We added some new objects, we expanded the footprint of the Nantucket story, and we added also, or rather took the opportunity of kind of stretching out into the mezzanine area outside of the McCausland Gallery to introduce Sarg to people who may not be familiar with him as an artist. You can say that he is the man responsible for inventing the parade balloons for Macy's, but he did so many other things. And so we used that space to really highlight his work as a very prolific and a very multifaceted artist. We also feature his work at 4 World's Fairs during the 1930s, and a whole slew of really astonishing commercial interiors that he designed in the 20s, in the 30s as well, as a public artist. So we're kind of using that mezzanine as an introduction to Sarg, a teaser, and a look at kind of his broad scope of work before you go into the gallery and dig into the specific areas. Inside the gallery, we organize the stories, as I said, with the personal and the professional kind of bouncing back and forth as you walk through. We added a new interactive related to his work with mechanical books, which is a lot of fun at the very end of the show, new objects. And then one of the big changes was we added a lot more images of Sarg himself, including a lot of his self-portraits and illustrations, so that he could really be felt as a presence throughout the entire experience, so that you're seeing him as you're seeing the work that he's producing. He's a very mischievous figure, a very fun figure who liked to poke fun at himself in particular, and it's great that we were able to highlight him throughout the entire show. And then, of course, we wrapped everything up in a really, really beautiful new exhibition design by Helen Riegel and Kurt Weidman. It's colorful, it's immersive. I think it really takes inspiration from Sarg's work and helps you kind of get in the mood as you walk through and see all of these creative and playful things that he created. So now that we have a little background and context for the Tony Sarg collection, where Genius at Play came from as an exhibition, why it's here, and how it was adapted, we can actually meet the man. This is one of my favorite photographs of him. He's standing on the steps of a Goodyear airship or balloon. That's who he worked with for the Macy's parade, looking very dapper with his cane and his hat. And the rest of the presentation really does mirror the structure of the exhibition upstairs, looking at his personal life and professional areas of work. And the goal is to really show how Sarg, he consistently found opportunities to propel his career forward. He would start one thing, use that to leverage work into another endeavor, and how his curiosity and mischievous nature really led him down some pretty unique professional paths. So Tony Sarg was born in 1880 in Guatemala, which may not be what you first expect. But his father was German, his mother was English. His father actually emigrated to Central America from Germany in the 1860s, and he attempted mining before getting into the coffee business and was part of a German community of settlers in the Alta Verapaz region there in Guatemala. And Francis Sarg, Sarg's father, he served as consul for the German Empire for Guatemala, and by some accounts he was also an amateur artist, as well as a naturalist and a musician. So creativity kind of runs in the family. And Sarg's own interest in art and puppetry really started at a very, very young age. He loved to share or give credit to his grandmother, who was an artist, Mary Ellen Best. You can see a work of hers in the upper corner there. It's a portrait of Sarg's father. She also had a remarkable toy collection, and it's something that Sarg always cites when talking about the trajectory of his career, which he later inherited. But around the age of 7, the family returned to Germany for Sarg for the first time to live there. He was enrolled in a military academy, and when he was 17, he was commissioned as a lieutenant in the German army. Not, again, what you would expect for what you see him do later. He did serve in the German army from about 1897 until 1905, but during this time he was always sketching, painting, creating, however he could. He was completely self-taught as an artist, which is remarkable. It's impressive given the quality of the watercolors and sketches that you see upstairs from his early years. He even contributed illustrations to at least 2 German-language children's books while he was still in the military, but they were published right around the time he decided to resign his commission. That's in 1905. By some accounts, it was against his father's wishes, but either way, he decided to move to England and really launch a career as a professional artist. There is a book we have upstairs as well that you see on the far right here. It's called Didi and Company by Josepha Metz. And it has a wonderful inscription inside from Sarg himself, writing that it was the first book published while still in the German army. He's very proud of himself. It's a lovely little book. He did like to credit his experience in the military. It wasn't like it was a sad time for him. There's a lot of letters that he enjoyed traveling, he enjoyed the camaraderie. He liked to credit his truly remarkable energy, as well as his instinct for efficiency to his time in the German army. But it was not the life that he wanted for himself. He was determined to become a professional artist, moved to England in 1905. Although he was only in London for 10 years, it's an extremely important period in his life, both personally and professionally. He managed to support himself, first and foremost, as an illustrator. Again, he had already published a few things. He was more experienced. He wasn't just a complete novice stepping into an unknown world. He had started to pave the way before traveling to London. And he managed to find work designing advertisements. He contributed cartoons to publications like The Sketch and The Tatler, and he received commissions for book illustrations. During this time, he had maintained a relationship with Bertha McGowan, who's an American that he met while he was still in Germany. They were married, and in 1911 had their daughter Mary. London is also where that early childhood fascination with toys and puppets and all things mechanical was really peaked again, and most importantly. And it's where he began to experiment with new puppetry techniques and to personally perform in front of small audiences in his studio. So a critical kind of turning point in his life and career. But he chose to, or it was necessary for him to leave, primarily because of the arrival of World War I. But before that, it's worth calling attention to some of the work that he did while he was in England. In terms of his career, he liked to share the story of how he would go dig through old newspapers to find jokes or humorous anecdotes that he could then illustrate and sell. He was always looking for a way to maximize what was already available instead of creating something from whole cloth. And it's a practice of recycling that he actually continues throughout his career. The more you look at his work, the more you see the same or similar motifs and ideas, patterns and designs that he would repurpose and find creative uses for. One of the most significant projects during this time was one that he completed while in London for the London Underground. It's his Humors of London series, of which we have several plates, large works framed upstairs. It was created by the London Underground as an advertising campaign to promote travel during off-peak hours. So at the time, they were trying to reinvent themselves and really promote going to the park, going to the museum, using the transit system for anything other than just workaday purposes. And Sarg was one of several artists who were commissioned to create posters that were displayed in the stations across the city. They were very successful. His bird's eye views, which become somewhat of a signature throughout his career, are very colorful, very fun, full of humorous detail. And the Underground chose his series for use as a calendar in 1914. By this time, 1915, with the arrival of World War I, and especially with German air raids, there's a great rise, of course, in anti-German sentiment in England. Sarg starts to be asked to resign from various professional organizations, and he decides to relocate to New York in 1915. Despite this challenge, just as he's finding success as a commercial illustrator and a graphic artist, he arrives in New York as a very mature, very self-assured working artist. He's settled in Greenwich Village, and there's a great map here that he created a little bit later that's of the neighborhood where he lived and worked, showing a lot of the cultural kind of haunts. bookshops and restaurants and such. He also established a studio in the Flatiron Building, which was very smart, given that it was the home to several publishers at the time. And he set to work making connections and securing new illustration commissions. He really didn't waste a moment. Not only did he reestablish himself as a graphic artist pretty much immediately, but he also launched a new business with the Tony Sarg Marionette Company. New York was booming, and he was very much the right man in the right place, so to speak. The foundation of Sarg's success in England, as well as in the United States, really, at the start, but throughout, remained illustration. His innate understanding of how to attract and hold the audience's attention through detail and visual storytelling really served him well as he branched out into diverse fields. In addition to works for publications like Life, which you can see in the center here, in the Saturday Evening Post and other publications, he formed several successful relationships with authors, like the humorist Irvin S. Cobb, whose book, Speaking of Operations, is here on the left. He worked with Cobb on several projects, and by one account, Sarg said he was approached by Cobb just as he arrived in the United States, soliciting him to create illustrations for his next book. So his reputation really did precede him whenever he came to the United States, and he found work immediately. He continued to work with other authors, even as he started to launch a whole line of books under his own name, Tony Sarg's this and Tony Sarg's that. But illustration, without question, if you've taken a walk through the exhibition upstairs, was really just the beginning. For the first 2 to 5 years spent in New York really quite quickly, Sarg was increasingly focused on puppetry. Early efforts actually brought immediate success, like so many other things that he did. This allowed him to jumpstart work in related fields, as you can see here. And with each new endeavor, he reached new audiences and reinforced his popular appeal and his bankability. So although he never stopped working as an illustrator, it was really puppetry and his ability to keep expanding his name recognition through new enterprises that opened the door to real fame, and which allowed him to build a lasting brand over time. But why puppets? He's an illustrator. Why puppets, apart from his grandmother's collection? After 1917, as his fame as a puppeteer really grew, he had a short list of personal stories that he would circulate again and again. In addition to that toy collection that I've already mentioned, probably the primary story that he would share was about an experience he had while he was working as an illustrator in London. He attended a performance by Thomas Holden's marionettes, and was completely fascinated. He was just there to sketch the performance, but was captured fully by their performance. He asked the company or asked members for how they did their performance, tips or techniques, anything that they would share, and was completely rebuffed. So he wasn't deterred. He just returned again and again, by his account, at least 50 times, to watch the performance and figure it out for himself, which he did. Very mechanically minded, and put that to use then, going back to his studio, starting to experiment, even developing a new controller system while still in London working as a visual artist. Another reason that he would give for why puppets really comes from a particularly telling interview, a very long interview, but he explained that while he was trying to launch his career in England, he noticed that other graphic artists had some sort of party trick or skill or something that they could do to keep their name in the air, so to speak, that it was really bad form to self-promote. And so for him, he already had this interest and fascination, so he decided that puppets were going to be his way to attract attention, kind of have a name for himself as an interesting person, and gain commissions as an illustrator. And I think it's kind of hilarious how it turns into Tony Sarg, everything, all about self-promotion. when the inspiration was really as a way to kind of draw attention as an illustrator. It didn't take very long for this side project to really become his primary focus, especially once he arrived in New York. He continued to give salon-style performances in his studio at the Flatiron, the practice that he began while he was in London. This attracted a patron and helped him form the Tony Sarg Company to actually produce and perform marionette productions, which they did at small stages around New York, and attracted pretty much, again, like everything, really good press. He had worked as an illustrator, he knew the papers, he knew magazine writers, and he got his name into the papers almost immediately. And so in 1921, a touring company, Tony Sarg's Marionettes, was established, and they set out on the road, and basically did so every year for nearly 20 years. It's worth noting, though, that it's at this point, after the 1919 kind of Broadway debut with The Rose and the Ring, that Tony Sarg stopped performing with his company. He got them established and launched them out kind of on the road, but he remained in New York, where he would consult on productions, design publicity materials, and train new puppeteers as well. And he did so in such a way that he was able to keep his name in the press as his company was on the road. And that touring company, and sometimes there were more than one company traveling at any given time, kept his name kind of in people's minds, like in the papers all around the country, not just in New York, and exposed a lot of people to his brand of storytelling and puppetry. So it's safe to say, as I noted, that he outgrew that taboo of self-promotion. And in 1921, Sarg also published one of the first books to reveal marionette construction tips and performance guidance, the Tony Sarg Marionette Book. He's putting his name right there in the title. And the following year, he started teaching summer courses at his studio in New York. In addition to one of the book illustrations here, which is just great, showing a child performing, you can see materials belonging to the artist and educator Alma Thomas, who some of you may be familiar with, who actually participated in Sarg's class in 1934 when she was in New York to get her master's in art education at Columbia. Just a wonderful collection of material there at the Smithsonian. And the importance of Sarg as a teacher, as a mentor, and as a promoter of puppetry in the arts of America at the time really can't be overstated. His willingness to share, in contrast to his experience as a young performer or aspiring performer, really helped launch careers of many, many talented individuals, leading all the way to individuals like Jim Henson later. Keep coming back to 1921. This is when the touring company started. His book was published. It's also when he became a naturalized citizen of the United States. And he released the first in a series of animated short films. It might seem like a choice out of left field. I know whenever I went through the exhibition for the first time and saw this material and read about his work in this, it was like, why animation? How did he get there from puppetry and from his work as an illustrator? But it was really through illustration that he was introduced to the world of motion picture kind of production in the studios. He began work as an illustrator of film poster advertisements, including the one you see here that has Charlie Chaplin in a few kind of silly situations. But it's also his signature bird's eye view, and I just loved finding that. You also see here him visiting the Fox Movietone City in 1932. So he was always looking for the next big thing and the next way to promote himself. Okay, so but why animation? And it really goes back to puppetry. His expertise in puppetry formed the basis of his work in animation. And this quote is great, and it's very telling in terms of his need to tackle any technical challenge that presented itself. And between 1921 and 1927, even 1929, he created a series of short films as well as an animated sequence for the Hoover Vacuum Company. It was a sponsored film. And he did this with shadow puppets. So there's the connection. He also appeared in newsreels and other films that showed his marionettes in action, but his animation work really began earlier and in partnership with an individual named Herbert Dolly, who was a pioneer in the field of stop motion animation, specifically like claymation, dinosaurs and such. But I loved this newspaper piece where they're cooking up an ad campaign, and that's actually both of them on Nantucket. It was a great find to see that. His animations, as I noted, used shadow puppets. These were called often shadow graphs, which is a form that he had used in at least one of his marionette productions up to that point. In 1919, there was a scene in The Rose and the Ring that used silhouette shadow puppets. And so he took that, adapted it, and it was really the tool that he put to use for this animation work. Later, after the conclusion of Tony Sarg's almanac, which I'll talk about next, he also did the Willow Plate, a Chinese shadow graph story. So shadow puppets were a familiar form, but they also proved to be very adaptable and very cost-effective for film storytelling. Between 1921 and 23, Sarg and Dolly produced 18 humorous short films as part of the Tony Sarg's Almanac series. Again, Sarg's name right there. For this project, the pair developed a method by which Sarg's silhouettes could be positioned and filmed frame by frame, but it required only the two of them. And this was in contrast to the numerous artists in time it would take to create dozens, if not hundreds and hundreds of drawings for traditional hand-drawn animation. The films were shown with musical accompaniment. This is during the silent era, and they were part of packaged film programs. So Tony Sarg's Almanac would appear alongside other cartoons, newsreels, and travelogues prior to a featured presentation. It was a creative challenge that Sarg really did seem to relish, but more than anything, he would call attention to the cost savings and how quickly they were able to produce these films. The timing is also very important, going back to 1921, given that the Almanac series, which was distributed nationally, helped amplify Sarg's name recognition just as his marionette company was going on the road. Another twist on Sarg's puppetry are his parade balloons, which is probably what most everyone is familiar with when they think about Sarg, is his relationship with Macy's. But they were not an instant idea. They developed out of other commissions. And like so many other times in his life, as soon as he was done with the Almanac series, he finds himself with another opportunity, this time in 1923 with the R.H. Macy Company, who hired him that year to design display windows, holiday windows really, with mechanical marionettes in a storybook setting. It's around this time he also gets a partnership with an electronics company to then distribute these mechanical displays. The windows were a financial and popular success, and they were just the beginning in terms of Sarg's very productive relationship with Macy's and other department stores. After the success of his first window displays, Sarg was asked to return the following year as designer of not only the windows, but floats for Macy's first Christmas parade in 1924. There was a circus theme. It's not the most Christmassy, but it was a circus theme where they had clowns and even live animals from the Central Park Zoo participate in this parade. The parade led people straight to the store where Sarg's circus-themed windows were actually the main attraction. It was the parade that led you to the windows at the store where you could begin your holiday shopping. The work done for Macy's was, it led to the creation of Sarg's second business, the Tony Sarg Workshops, which was dedicated to designing window displays for department stores. They also did children's barbershops and contributed designs for trade shows. So you have his marionette company and now his window display company. Back at Macy's, the store continued its parade tradition, and in 1927, they premiered the first balloons that were created by Tony Sarg. These were fabricated by the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company in Akron, Ohio. And that year, the balloons were inflated with compressed air. They were very heavy, and they were held up by poles. The following year, 1928, is when Sarg introduced the helium-filled, kind of lighter weight floating balloons that were at the time described as upside-down marionettes that are still used to today. His balloons did not just appear in the Macy's parade, but they were featured actually in parades sponsored by other regional department stores. Sometimes they were original designs, like you see with the clown, which was a design created for the Jordan Marsh department store in Boston. And it seems that sometimes they might also have been sold secondhand by Macy's or reused and repainted. But Macy's was the parade that lasted the longest. And of course, the giant balloons are still there at the Thanksgiving Day parade today. The 20s were really busy for Sarg as he diversified his brand. It was of art as well as design. I mean, honestly, everything was busy for Sarg. Something you could say was a given throughout his life. And by 1925, he had several years of his touring productions for his marionette company. He had the animated series, Macy's parades, if not yet the balloons, under his belt, and his name was becoming a very attractive selling point. There were hotels and restaurants, department stores, as already noted, that started to hire Sarg to design murals, furniture, sometimes entire themed environments, as a lure for patrons. Seen here on the left is actually Sarg painting an absolutely enormous mural of Chicago. It's a bird's eye view of the city. This was installed on the ceiling of a coffee shop at the Hotel Sherman in Chicago. And for that hotel in 1925, he also designed a marionette-themed nightclub, the Bal Tabaran, that had a stage right in the middle of the dance floor and mechanical windows of marionettes kind of ringing the entire dining room. Remarkable. Other images that you see here are Sarg's murals at the Tony Sarg's Oasis Cafe at the Waldorf Astoria in New York, in the exterior of a themed coffee shop, the Marionette Coffee Shop, designed to look like something out of a Grimm's fairy tale. The interior had a similar style, and it really is the approach he took for another nightclub, Tony Sarg's Bohemia, also the Tony Sarg shops. All had the same look and were arriving at the same time. Sarg stretched his brand even further, if you can imagine, in the 1930s, through his participation in 4 expositions and World's Fairs across the country. His name, as well as his distinctive signature, which you can see on the pictorial map for the New York World's Fair on the far right, probably conjured up images of fun, feelings of fun, and also possibility. You never knew what Sarg was going to do next, and this mirrored the underlying impulse of the Depression-era World's Fairs. They're not events that you see today, really, or are probably very familiar with, but they were huge commercial enterprises, pumped a great deal of money into purpose-built developments filled with cultural pavilions and colorful midways. For the most part, Sarg's participation in these events was as a designer, but also as a showman. He designed maps, interiors, special attractions, sideshow attractions, and products. And members of his company, as well as some of his former company members, filled theatrical venues with daily performances with their marionette shows, reaching millions of people between 1933 with the Chicago Century of Progress Exposition and 1939 at the New York World's Fair. Okay, so you're probably wondering, when does he get to Nantucket? Also, in the 1920s, among all of these things that he's doing, somehow he manages to find time to take sort of a break, comes to visit Nantucket in 1920, brings his marionettes, to contribute to a fundraiser for the Nantucket Cottage Hospital, pretty much 1920-21, and in 21 purchases a home here where he visits and spends time with his family, his wife Bert and his daughter Mary. They would go on to spend time on island seasonally for more than 20 years. And given the huge range of business efforts and endeavors and enterprises and businesses, he didn't obviously spend his full summers here, but he would visit off and on each season. It's possible. I always get the question of why Nantucket, how did he come here? Of course, there's the actors colony that was here in the teens. We are guessing that he may have been introduced to or drawn to the island through the playwright Austin Strong. But once here, he was really part of the island's burgeoning, its own art colony. He was very connected to everything that was happening at that time. He traveled around sketching, painting, creating really wonderful watercolors, which you can see some of upstairs, and oil paintings like the Bonton Fish Market that's shown here, as well as more playful personal sketches like the image of Mary and the family dog Freckles on the envelope above. I love that it just says Nantucket. There's no address, but it managed to find its way to the right home. You can sometimes even see him. He puts himself into his pictorial maps and other designs, often as a small figure with his easel. He's painting or he's tramping around with it on its back, very similar to the photograph of him sketching on island right here. He did not come here just on vacation or to create personal art, but once he was here, rather, he used his celebrity and his talents as an artist to benefit islanders and their businesses as well, like the Skipper restaurant. You can see the bathroom door that he painted for the establishment on the far right, which they used in advertisements as a photograph for the restaurant. And of course, he was a great supporter and a friend to charities like the Nantucket Cottage Hospital, as already mentioned. He participated in Main Street Fetes and other fundraisers, doing lightning sketches on the waterfront, some of which are in the collection. One of the last newspaper notices to mention Sarg's activities on island are actually about his participation in a British war relief fundraiser in 1941. And if you're talking about Sarg's community activities, you have to mention the Nantucket sea monster, Morton. This is actually one of Sarg's Macy's parade balloons that he transported in secret to Nantucket in the summer of 1937, part of an elaborate summertime hoax. The event required the buy-in of the local paper, Inquirer, Mirror, and also other business leaders. It involved planting sea monster tracks on the beach. There were sightings of the head floating in the harbor, all of which, once it was revealed, resulted in a community celebration where Morton was fully inflated, ready for his close-up. And there's lots of great snapshots in the collection of people taking pictures with Morton that we have to this day, which is wonderful. Next month, on July 31st, I should just call out that there'll be a talk about the sea monster with Chief Curator Michael Harrison, leading up to Morton's return, if you haven't already heard, on August 5th as part of the free Sarg Community Day at Children's Beach. So bring your own cameras for that, and then donate those pictures to us. Sarg's sea monster hoax was, in part, a publicity stunt for the Tony Sarg shop. It was also meant to draw attention and tourist dollars, frankly, to Nantucket during the Depression. A few years after the family took up residence on Nantucket, Bert Sarg, Tony's wife, Bert, opened a small seasonal gift shop or curio shop called the Green Umbrella on Federal Street. It's actually where the, I think it's the tourist office, the public restroom is right there. And Sarg almost immediately started to design products for sale within that shop. And first and foremost were his bandboxes, which I'm sure everybody's heard of Tony Sarg bandboxes, but these were definitely one of the first products that he designed. But there were also maps, map of Nantucket, books and prints and other textiles that he developed. The specific shop that Bert developed moved to another location on Center Street, and then eventually led to the establishment of the Tony Sarg shop in 1934 on Easy Street at the head of Steamboat Wharf, which is what you see here in the photograph on the left. There were additional Tony Sarg shops established. There are records of a shop in Marblehead. There's even photographs of an interior and an exterior, but I do wonder whether it was open for any great length of time and would welcome any information if someone has about that particular shop. But most long-lived of all was a shop that he opened in New Hope, Pennsylvania. This is where his daughter Mary settled after she was married, and she managed that shop for many years, along with the one on Nantucket with her mother. That particular shop lasted well into the 60s, possibly even the 1970s. But there are mentions of a Tony Sarg shop in Manhattan that his wife was running in the late 20s, early 30s. But the Nantucket shop was the first, and I think I'm not alone in really wishing it was just down the road. The building is still there in part, but unfortunately no longer the Tony Sarg shop. So although he came to Nantucket ostensibly for R&R with his family, one could argue, he really never stopped working or being inspired. And beginning in the early to the mid-1920s, Nantucket motifs start to appear in not only the products that he designed for his wife's shop, but other department stores like Marshall Field's in Chicago, as well as his wider body of commercial work. You see whaling ships, whales, figures from Nantucket history, Sankaty Lighthouse, the oldest house, and more that recur as visual motifs. And upstairs we have a few of these in a special display dedicated to his island, sources of island inspiration. It also seems this work led to the formation of a third business, somewhat confusingly named Tony Sarg Studios, which were established in response to the demand for Sarg-designed giftwares in the mid-1920s. In addition to the products that Sarg designed for his namesake shops and distributed through his giftwares business, he also created work for a range of manufacturers, and these are just a few of the commercial goods that Sarg had a hand in designing. They could be found at department stores, Main Street establishments, also by mail order. He created something for literally everyone. There were playful wallpapers and textiles, like you see the Alice in Wonderland wallpaper here, which has his name along the side. There are the marionette prints, also seen here, which also have his name emblazoned on the side. There are also these beautiful kind of elegant porcelain wares, these powder jars, the figures of the ladies here, and then toys. In the early 1930s, he was approached by the Madame Alexander Doll Company to develop a line of marionettes. He was well known, he was a celebrity, and it only made sense that you would have Tony Sarg marionettes through the Madame Alexander Company. And these are some from the Tingling Circus instead of the Ringling Circus. There were 2 sets of Tingling Circus marionettes, but many more were produced. And following Tony Sarg's involvement with that, Madame Alexander, the company, turned to Walt Disney and started to produce Disney marionettes as well. Among his branded products, there's a series of namesake books that were published between 1924 and 1942, and even after his death, that I think really remain some of the most beloved works that he ever created. I think this is probably because they can be seen as they're really a distillation of his many talents. There's illustrations and stories that are filled with a lot of action, wit, and whimsy. And some, like his book for children, which you can see on the left, combine a really eclectic mix of adventure stories woven in and around pages that are bursting with his colorful illustrations. There are others that fall into the category of mechanical books, which are fascinating, or puzzle books, that literally break the page with flaps and wheels, die-cut pieces, moving parts, sometimes even little puppets, really innovative and complicated works that show his mechanical genius. They also show his constant desire for movement. And seen here, you have the treasure book, which was actually published in 1942, and a page from the dummy for another book that was not published, but we've replicated 2 of its drawings upstairs as an interactive that lets you see the movements that were intended. Along with his toy marionettes, his books really stand out as some of his most meaningful commercial products, given how aligned they are with his first love of illustration and drawing, as well as his passion for puppetry and his really strong desire to inspire creativity in others. After everything that's been described so far, it's probably not hard to see why, if not how, Sarg was stretched quite thin by the end of the 1930s with his 3 businesses and other activities, and he was forced to declare bankruptcy. There are stories that circulate that it was because of too many souvenirs designed for the New York World's Fair, too many products, too little profit. But I think he had so many irons in the fire. He also was co-owner in an apartment building in Greenwich Village that he was unable to continue making payments on. But whatever reason, he was forced to declare bankruptcy and dissolved his marionette company. It's a very sad thing that happened. And the production of Robin Hood that was currently on the road at the time was halted, and marionettes were actually distributed as payment for back wages. The following year, puppeteers from around the country came together to celebrate Sarg's 60th birthday and shared all sorts of really lovely hand-drawn birthday card kind of gifts that were compiled into a birthday book and given to him. And I think it's very poignant, given the financial difficulties that he was suffering at the time. But more than that, it really shows the degree to which he was not only celebrated by the public or really recognized for his contributions to puppetry, even though he wasn't performing himself, but by his peers for everything he had done to promote the puppetry arts throughout his entire career as a promoter and as a really kind of the face of quality marionette performance and education. It's wonderful, and we've got several of those letters upstairs. And sadly, all stories come to an end, and 2 years later, Sarg underwent surgery for a ruptured appendix and ultimately succumbed due to an infection. At that time, he was in the middle of completing a variety of book projects, including Tony Sarg's treasure book, which I've mentioned, that his daughter Mary completed on his behalf. There are even some notices that Mary was going to change her name to Tony with an I, and continue her father's work. On Nantucket, Sarg's wife Bert did return, but ended up selling their home pretty soon after his death, and the Tony Sarg shop, however, remained in operation until the early 1950s. Hopefully, this presentation, all of this information that you've just received, is showing the skill with which Sarg did span the worlds of art and enterprise, and how it was really his charming personality that helped guide audiences and consumers alike from one delight to the next. He is a very fascinating and a very fun figure to study, always finding out some new thing that he did. He was a person whose ambition and his entrepreneurial instincts were really balanced by his generous and mischievous spirit, making him not only a genius at play, as the title asserts, but a man for whom play was really his particular genius. And I just want to say thank you and ask if there are any questions. Just wait for the microphone, if you could.
Is it possible he could have drawn all that artwork himself, or did he have assistants who he would train with his point of view?
His daughter would say that she had been trained and she was able to complete his work. It was mostly finished. And there are other artists around the time of his death the one that I was able to find, his name was Emery Gondor, who became a book, an author and illustrator himself. And there are some works that were done with the BFJ company, toys and books, that you can see a slight difference in style that I think they're using Sarg's name, but blending some of his work with other artists. But otherwise, he would repurpose his own illustrations really again and again. One of my favorite examples is up on the mezzanine in the World's Fair area. He designed a mural for the Nabisco Company for a theater at the New York World's Fair that shows all sorts of animals and elephants holding boxes of crackers. But it's the same kind of view that appears on his letterhead and also appears in the Waldorf Astoria, where they're holding cocktail shakers and glasses and food. But they're identical. So he would repurpose his own illustrations and art. There's a dinosaur in his Tony Sarg's alphabet that he also used for Tony Sarg's almanac. So I think he was creating these works, but he was finding ways to constantly use them in as many locations and ways as possible. Yeah, just 1 second. Yeah, of course.
Was he a contributor to the New Yorker magazine?
He did have illustrations that were in the New Yorker, yeah. Yeah.
I've seen a lot of his work.
Stephanie Plunkett and Lenore Miller, who were co-curators of the original exhibition, and it makes sense given Norman Rockwell as an illustrator, working in magazines at the same time as a younger man, but they were working were contemporaries. And they observed that he really did prefer the really kind of fast, loose sketches of those types of cartoons versus the more involved or kind of detailed cover art and illustrations. He did a lot of cartoons for Parents Magazine, New Yorker, and others, and that was his preferred mode. That was a lot of information.
So his bankruptcy fascinates me.
I know, me too.
And it seems to me he was a great artist and a terrible businessman. Every time he turned, tell me if I'm wrong, but he seemed to buy houses all over the place. And whenever he had money, he spent it. And is that really sort of, it's not his absence of success, it's his own.
Absolutely. I'm fascinated too, and finding the article or the notice that said that he was co-owner of an apartment building and owed all of this money on that mortgage. This is in the Depression. By this time, there's a lot more competition in terms of the number of puppetry companies and troupes that are traveling around the country competing for dollars. He's still continuing to kind of recycle some of the performances and plays that he's done in the past. And by now, it's 10, 15 years into his career, and you have new puppeteers coming up and doing new types of productions. I think he was probably struggling in that regard. He was producing a lot of products for his shop after 1934. I think he was trying to find ways to generate income and trying to promote himself, but it was increasingly more and more of a challenge. And of course, he was overextending himself, owning an apartment building. I mean, he did have the house in New Jersey, but he had that for a long stretch of time. That was so that his daughter could attend school there, and that was one of his primary residences in the winter versus coming to Nantucket in the summer. So he had the studio in New York, but that was more as a base of operations for the puppet company for training and teaching classes. I would love to find out more about his bankruptcy, to be honest, because it's a bit of a mystery. You often give, or rather, it's simplified as just, he made too many souvenirs for the New York World's Fair, but that's just, it can't be just that. He had a lot of things going on, and I think it all just kind of came in at once.
And so did he meet the Macy's from Nantucket? I mean, is that his association with the parade is from the Macy family here?
It's a good question. I don't know how he was connected to them in the 1923 time period. He was doing and what his first window display was. That I don't know. I haven't found a good answer for what that connection is. He was on Nantucket. There is a connection there, but I don't think it's necessarily that's how he was approached. He'd done so many and would give talks, marionette talks and production, like performances on stage even after his company was gone. He would do demonstrations. And so he had this kind of showman quality that I think, and there was a desire to kind of return to the displays. But the windows precede his mechanical displays at the Bell Tabaran in Chicago. So there's something that motivated them to reach out to him to create these mechanical displays. They also precede his work with the children's barbershops at department stores. So it really starts with Macy's. And I haven't found a really good answer yet for like, why did they reach out to him for this very specific type of work? There is, but it's him as a visual artist, as a puppeteer, why go to the mechanical component for the windows? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
Am I missing the history of anybody writing a biography, or did he have a diary or a memoir, something that you can really use, or did he leave it up to you now to?
I know. So there is a woman who wrote a biography of him. It's kind of a self-published book that you can find. It's really quite good, and I'm, of course, going to completely blank on her name that you can find. It's the only one that I know of. It's really quite detailed, and there's a good chunk of Paul McFarlane's history of puppetry that talks about Tony Sarg. I think part of the problem is because he worked in so many different areas, you get these kind of niche biographies, particularly that he wrote about himself, whether it be about creating products. You'll find a lot of him telling his own story of how he got into doing that in a particular trade publication. But then later, primarily his work in puppetry is where you find biographers most interested, and so they focus on that. But trying to fill in the gaps of like animation, you have to go to magazines of the day, newspapers of the day, to start piecing it together. There's not one comprehensive biography. Truly, the catalog that was produced by the Norman Rockwell Museum is the first attempt to put all of these things into one place. I wish there were, but there's not. Yes, do you have the microphone?
Is the Melissa Sweet book mentioned in the exhibit?
No, it's in the shop, and I have a feeling it's probably going to come up whenever the Macy's parade talk
Any
happens.
grandparents in the room, they should know about that.
Oh, that's wonderful.
That's a wonderful book.
Definitely. She did a beautiful job, and it's this kind of great kind of collage style that she employed. It's beautiful. Highly recommend people take a look. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, Deborah, for preparing that wonderful, comprehensive talk. So I will share, related to your question there, Melissa Sweet will actually be coming to give a lecture in October of this year. So stay tuned for announcements on that. I also want to share our next lecture that is part of this Tony Sarg series will happen here at the museum in exactly 2 weeks. So Wednesday, the 26th at 5:30. And it'll feature speaker Darren Johnson, who is the founder of the American Theater of Puppetry Arts, a Sarg enthusiast, and a contributor to the Tony Sarg catalog that Deborah just mentioned. So please join us for that. Thank you for coming out this evening, and one more round of applause for Deborah, our curator.